Hello, and welcome to part two of the disasters of the 14th century, the historical events that are going to lead up to the Renaissance and the birth of modern Europe. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Babylonian Captivity in the Western Schism. So during the Middle Ages, there had been contention between secular authorities, meaning princes, kings, or the Holy Roman Emperor, essentially kind of like the High King of Germany, and the Pope. And in 1302, Pope Boniface VIII declared Unum Sanctum, which essentially said that the Pope is in charge of all human beings in the world, and there can only be salvation through the Catholic Church. This really ticked off Philip IV of France. France at the time was one of the largest and most powerful kingdoms in Europe. So he sent soldiers through Italy to Rome to arrest the Pope. Boniface died, and the cardinals in Rome who elected the Pope were intimidated by the military presence of these French soldiers. So they elected a Pope who would essentially be manipulated as a puppet by Philip, and then Philip decided to move the papal residency away from Rome to Avignon in southern France, where he could keep a closer eye on the Bishop of Rome. Now this is problematic because obviously the Bishop of Rome should be in Rome, not in Avignon. But Philip had his way. Nobody could really stop him from doing this. And while the Pope lived in Avignon for almost 100 years, we call this time period the Babylonian Captivity in reference to the Jews who were exiled to Babylon after the destruction of the First Temple. So here's just a nice little picture that shows the papal residence in Avignon, which looks more like a castle really than a palace. And in some ways, well, it was a palace, it was a castle, it was also a prison, right? The Avignon popes were under the direct control of the kings of France. Here's another picture. You can get a sense of the scale of the papal residence in Avignon. And there's a list of the popes. Now, in 1378, the people of Rome were tired of not having a pope in Rome. It was problematic. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, should be in Rome. So they rioted, and because of the duress caused by that riot, the cardinals voted for Urban VI. Now, it turned out that Urban was a major reformer and wanted to clean up the Catholic Church, which the cardinals did not want. They wanted to maintain their power and wealth. So they left the city and voted again, this time for Robert of Geneva, a Swiss priest who would become Clement VII, and he would be in Avignon. So now, in this period from 1378 to 1414, we have at least two popes. At one point, there's actually three. But this causes a big problem for Western Europe. Instead of dividing along religious lines, people essentially gave their loyalty to whatever pope fit their political interest. And we're going to see this on a map in a second. I'll explain. But this division between Western Christendom really undermined the religious authority of the Catholic Church and contributed to the growth of proto-Protestant movements, in particular the Lollard movement of John Wycliffe of England. So on this map, we can see some of the divisions that are becoming problematic in Europe. We can see that France here is in support, or the French king at least, is in support of the Pope in Avignon. That should not come as a surprise. The French king controls the Pope in Avignon. England supports the Pope in Rome. Now, this isn't necessarily because they have any direct affinity to this representative of God that happens to be in Rome. It's because the English hate the French, and they don't want to give allegiance to the French Pope. The Scottish hate the English, so they support the Pope in Avignon because of their political ties to France, because they have a common enemy in England. Now we can go around the map of Europe and make more of these connections. For example, the hatred between Portugal and Castile, or the tension between northern and southern Italy. So this leads us to John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was a priest and professor at Oxford who we're going to call a proto-Protestant. He believed that individuals could achieve salvation independent of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and opposed the acquisition of wealth by church officials and by wealthy monastic orders. He's also the first person to translate the Bible into English that we know of, and was all around a supporter of the common people having direct interaction with sacred texts. The movement that he led became known as the Lollards, and was eventually persecuted by both civil as well as religious authorities. He died in 1384 of a stroke before he could be declared a heretic. In steps Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a young man when John Wycliffe died, but in faraway Bohemia, what we now call the Czech Republic, he was influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe, who were transmitted to him through the scholarly network of Europe. Jan Hus, or John Hus, Jan, is the Czech or German version of John, which is itself a derivative of a Jewish name, but I digress. Jan Hus opposed indulgences, which were payment to the church to alleviate one's time in purgatory, and believed that the Crusades, Christian sacred wars, were contradictory to biblical truth. He also opposed church hierarchies and the distance created between worship and the common person. Now, these are all points that Martin Luther is essentially going to make about 100 years later. But Jan Hus makes them before the invention of the printing press, and that's significant. So, in 1415, they had the Council of Constance, which was, Constance is in, Austria, modern-day Austria, the purpose of which was to decide, one, what are we going to do about having two popes? We got to clear this mess up. There can only be one pope. The other thing is, what are we going to do with John Wycliffe and his heresies, or his teachings, because this was the council that was going to decide whether or not they were heretical. And what are we going to do with John Wycliffe's student or protege, Jan Hus? So eventually they decide to end the Western Schism and only have one pope, and they vote on a new pope, which was great. But then they summoned Jan Hus away from Bohemia to Constance with a guarantee of safety by the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, when Hus arrived, he was informed that Wycliffe's teachings had been declared heretical. Now, those present at the council didn't have a predisposition to kill Jan Hus. But what Jan Hus said to them, and I'm paraphrasing here, but what he said to them when he was confronted with the fact that his great mentor, John Wycliffe, was a heretic and was likely burning in hell, Hus essentially said, if John Wycliffe is a heretic, then I'd rather burn in hell with him than be here with you people. Who knows, probably some unsavory tone for sure at the Council of Constance on the part of both the authorities and Jan Hus. They were shocked by this, and essentially they had no other option but to declare him a heretic, and Jan Hus was burnt at the stake. Now, this triggered an anti-Catholic and anti-German rebellion in Bohemia that was sparked by the first defenestration of Prague, and it's not nearly as important as the one we're going to learn about from 1618 that sparks the 30 Years' War. But defenestration was something that the people of Prague were down with. Defenestration means when you throw someone out of a window. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the 30 Years' War. Now, this anti-Catholic rebellion in Bohemia was never put down. They were very upset about the murder at the hands of these church officials of their hero Jan Hus. And so little old Bohemia there in the green went to war with the rest of the Holy Roman Empire, with the German-speaking world. These Czechs or Bohemians for decades defended themselves from German crusades to re-Catholicize Bohemia, but none of these crusades against the Hussites, as they became known, were successful. So Bohemia kind of had an independent church that was parallel to the Catholic Church for 100 years. So at the end of the day, here's a nice little timeline of what happened. But there was this sense after the Council of Constance that the councils were the most powerful representation of God's will on earth, as opposed to a pope themselves. And that will later be challenged by Pope Julius II and the Renaissance popes. Now, finally, one of the last things we're going to talk about before we get to the Renaissance is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. This is arguably the most important date and event of the 300 years, around this time. So anywhere between 1300 and 1600, it's really hard to think of a more important date and event than the fall of Constantinople. Now, Constantinople was defeated in 1453 by the Ottoman Turks. But Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the last bastion of the Eastern Roman Empire that had ruled as one of the most powerful states in the Eastern Mediterranean for 1,000 years. So the Turks originally were mercenaries who fought for the Byzantines starting around 1300. They were paid in land in Anatolia, what we now call Turkey or Asia Minor. But eventually they turned on their Byzantine paymasters and established an empire of their own. By 1453, Constantinople was the last remaining vestige of this empire, and it was conquered by Mehmet the Conqueror. So, why is this important? The conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which will eventually be renamed and called Istanbul. Well, for one, it gave the Ottoman Empire control of one of the most important trading locations in the world, and this is the Dardanelles, the strait that connects the Black Sea and its ports that connect it with Central Asia to the Mediterranean and the rest of Europe. Now, at this time, Constantinople was the end of the Silk Road, and the Silk Road brought the riches of the East, textiles, spices, you name it, gold, all these things from the East to the West, to Europe. Now, once this trade route gets cut off, the Silk Road gets kind of cut off from Western Europe because of the conquest of Constantinople by the Byzantines, by the Ottomans. Europeans start to look for other ways to get access to the bounties of the Orient. And the most obvious way this is going to manifest is in Portuguese and Spanish exploration for a route around Africa to India, which they eventually find in the 1490s. It's also going to lead to the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus, who was also trying to find a new route to the Indies. Additionally, the fall of Constantinople helps jumpstart the Renaissance, because even in the decades before that, Greek scholars and artists fled the Turkish conquest and went to Italy, where they would become teachers of ancient Greek and of the classical texts that had been lost to Western Europe. And one of the most notable texts that they reintroduced to Western Europe is Plato's Republic. And then finally, it establishes the Ottomans as the greatest empire in the world. For the next several hundred years, the Ottoman Empire will be an existential threat to Christians in Eastern and Central Europe. All right, so now we've covered our bases and we can jump into our study of the Renaissance. Thank you and have a great day.